Story 1. Figure at the tree line. My daughter drew it 3 weeks before I ever saw it myself. She was 7 years old. We had just moved into our new house in rural Kentucky, about 40 miles outside Lexington. Thick forest on 3 sides of the property. An old farmhouse that needed work but had good bones and 5 acres of land. Perfect for raising a family away from the city. My wife was excited about the garden she could plant. I was looking forward to teaching my daughter about nature. The quiet, the peace, the life we couldn't afford closer to town. On our second weekend there, my daughter was drawing at the kitchen table while I unpacked boxes. She was using her crayons, hunched over her paper with that intense focus kids get when they recreating something important. When she finished, she held it up proudly. She had drawn our house, the woods behind it, and standing at the tree line, where the backyard met the forest, she had drawn a figure. Tall and thin, no face, just a blank oval where the head should be. Long arms hanging down past its knees. I asked her what it was. She said it was the man who watches. She said he stands at the edge of the woods every night, just watching the house. I laughed and told her she had a good imagination. Asked if she'd been watching too many scary movies. She got quiet and said no. The man was real. He was there every night, watching her window. I am 41 years old. I work in IT. I am a practical person. I believe in things I can measure and verify. When your 7-year-old tells you about a faceless man in the woods, you assume it's either a nightmare, an overactive imagination, or something she saw on YouTube that she wasn't supposed to be watching. You don't assume she is documenting something real. But 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday night in late September, I saw it myself. I was up late working on a project deadline. My wife and daughter were asleep upstairs. Around 1 a.m, I got up to get water from the kitchen. Our house is old, built in the 1870s, and the kitchen window looks directly out over the backyard to the tree line about 70 yards away. I was filling my glass when movement caught my eye. Something at the edge of the forest. I looked up. A figure was standing there, exactly where my daughter had drawn it. Tall, impossibly tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet. Thin in a way that looked wrong, like someone had taken a normal person and stretched them vertically. The proportions were off. Arms too long, legs too thin, and even from 70 yards away, even in the darkness with only the moon providing light, I could see that where its face should be, there was nothing. Just a smooth, blank surface. No features, no details, nothing. It was perfectly still, not moving, not swaying with the wind, just standing there, watching. I felt its attention focused on the house, on me, even though it had no eyes. I knew it was looking directly at me through that kitchen window. I stood frozen with my glass of water halfway to my mouth. My brain was trying to process what I was seeing. Part of me was insisting this was a trick of light and shadow. A tree stump or a dead branch catching moonlight in a weird way. Pareidolia. The human tendency to see faces and figures in random patterns. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Then it moved, just slightly. It raised one of those 2 long arms and tilted its blank head. Like it was acknowledging that I had seen it. Like it was pleased that I had finally noticed. I dropped my glass. It shattered on the kitchen floor. I ran to the back door and flipped on the floodlights that lit up our backyard. Bright halogen bulbs that could illuminate a football field. The lights blazed to life. I looked at the tree line. Nothing. Empty. Just trees and undergrowth and darkness beyond the reach of the lights. I told myself I had imagined it. Stress from the move. Too much caffeine. Working too late. My eyes playing tricks. I cleaned up the broken glass and went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that figure. That blank face. That tilting head. And I kept thinking about my daughter. This drawing. She had seen it first. Weeks before me. Which meant it had been there. Watching. The next morning, I walked out to the tree line. I wanted to find some evidence. Footprints. Broken branches. Something that would either confirm or deny what I'd seen. The ground near the trees was soft from recent rain. I found impressions in the dirt. Not footprints exactly. More like pressure marks. 2 elongated depressions where something had stood for a long time. The grass around them was flattened in a circle about 6 feet across. And there was something else. On several tree trunks at roughly the same height, maybe 7 feet up, I found scratches. Long gouges in the bark. 4 parallel lines on each tree. Like something with 4 fingers on each hand had been gripping the trunks. Holding on. The scratches were deep. Whatever made them was strong enough to tear into hardwood. I started researching. Spent hours looking up similar sightings. I found more than I expected. Way more. Stories from all over Appalachia, Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, North Carolina. Rural areas mostly. Properties that backed up to forest. People reported seeing a tall, thin, faceless figure standing at tree lines. Always at the edge, always watching, never coming closer, never speaking, just observing. The entity had different names depending on the region. The Watcher, the Tall Man, the Observer. Some people connected it to older folklore, said it was a forest spirit. Others thought it might be related to disappearances in the mountains. Hikers who went missing, children who wandered off and were never found. But most reports were like mine. The figure appeared. It watched. It disappeared when confronted. No violence, no direct threat, just presence, just observation. But I also found stories about what happened to people who saw it repeatedly. How the sightings would escalate. The figure would appear closer each time, more frequently, and eventually, it would stop just watching. It would start interacting, leaving signs, moving objects, making sounds. And in a few cases, people reported that it had tried to enter their homes. I didn't tell my wife. Didn't want to scare her. Didn't want her to think I was losing my mind. But I started staying up later, keeping watch, and every night, around 1 or 2 in the morning, the figure would appear at the tree line. Always in the same spot. Always standing perfectly still. Always watching the house. After a week of this, my daughter started having nightmares. She would wake up screaming. My wife would comfort her, but she wouldn't say what the dreams were about. Just that the man was getting closer, that he wanted to come inside, that he was waiting for something. I installed motion sensor lights around the property, covered every angle. If anything approached the house, lights would trigger. I also set up a trail camera pointed at the tree line. If this thing was real, I would get proof. I would document it, show it to someone, maybe call the police, maybe reach out to a university. Someone would have an explanation. The trail camera captured it on the first night. Dozens of photos triggered by movement. In every single image, the figure was there, standing at the tree line, perfectly still. The time stamps showed it remained in position for hours, from midnight until just before dawn. Never moving, never leaving, just watching. And in some of the photos, it appeared to be closer. Maybe 50 yards from the house instead of 70. The camera was supposed to trigger if anything crossed into its sensor range, but I had no photos of it approaching. It was just suddenly closer, like it was moving in the spaces between photos. On the 10th night, I heard tapping on my daughter's window. Her bedroom is on the 2nd floor, 20 feet off the ground. I ran upstairs and burst into her room. She was sitting up in bed, staring at the window, trembling. The curtains were open. I looked outside. Nothing. Just darkness and trees. Then I saw it, standing directly below her window. Looking up, it would have needed to be at least 10 or 12 feet tall to be looking at a 2nd-story window from ground level. And it had gotten taller. Or maybe it had always been that tall and I misjudged the distance before. I yelled at it, told it to leave, to get off my property. It didn't react, didn't move, just kept that blank face pointed at the window. At my daughter, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shined it directly at the figure. In the bright LED light, I could see more details. Its skin was pale, almost white, with a texture that looked wrong. Too smooth, like plastic or wax. And where the face should be, there really was nothing. No indentations for eyes or nose or mouth. Just a smooth, blank surface. The light seemed to bother it. The figure took a step backward, then another. It moved in a way that was disturbing. Not walking exactly, more like gliding. Its legs moved but didn't. They seemed to be bearing weight, like it was being pulled backward by invisible strings. It retreated to the tree line, stopped, and then, for the first time, it raised both arms and spread them wide. Like it was displaying itself, like it was showing me how large it was, how long its reach could be. Then it turned and walked into the forest, disappeared between the trees. I watched for an hour. It didn't return. The next morning, I found something on our back porch. A small pile of objects arranged in a circle. Stones, bones, and pieces of metal that looked like they came from old farm equipment. They were organized by size. Smallest in the center, largest on the outside. And in the exact middle of the circle was a child's toy. A small plastic horse. The same toy my daughter had lost in the backyard 2 weeks earlier. We had searched for it, never found it. Now it was back, placed carefully in the center of this arranged circle. That is when I understood. This thing wasn't just watching. It was communicating, leaving messages. showing us it could access our property whenever it wanted, that it could take things, that it knew us, knew our daughter, and it was getting bolder. I told my wife everything that night. Showed her the photos from the trail camera, the scratches on the trees, the arranged objects on the porch. She wanted to call the police. I told her they wouldn't. To believe us. What would we say? There is a tall, faceless man watching our house. They think we were crazy or on drugs. We needed a different solution. I reached out to a professor at the University of Kentucky, someone who specialized in Appalachian folklore, sent him the photos and a description of what we experienced. He responded within hours, said he'd seen similar reports, said there was a pattern. The entity appeared to families with young children. It watched for weeks or months, built up a presence. Then it would try to make contact with the child. And if it succeeded, if the child acknowledged it or responded to it in any way, the entity would become attached, would follow the family, would escalate its behavior. He said the only solution was to leave, to move, get distance from the location where the sightings began. The entity seemed to be territorial, tied to specific forest areas. If we left, it likely wouldn't follow, probably. We put the house on the market the next day, sold it at a loss 3 weeks later, moved to a subdivision in Lexington. No woods, no tree lines, just houses and streetlights and neighbors close enough to hear if we scream. We've been here for 6 months now. No sightings, no nightmares. My daughter has stopped drawing pictures of the man who watches. She seems happy, adjusted, normal. But sometimes, late at night, I look out our window at the small strip of trees behind the subdivision. And I wonder if something is standing there, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, watching, waiting, learning where we live now. Because I've been researching more, going deeper into the reports, and I found something disturbing. Some people who moved away from their sightings reported that the figure eventually found them again, months or years later, standing at whatever new tree line existed near their new home. Like it had followed, like it had tracked them. Like once it chose you, once it decided your family was worth watching, it never really let go. Last week, my daughter drew another picture. She didn't show it to me. I found it in her room when I was putting away laundry. It was a drawing of our new house, the subdivision, the strip of trees behind our fence. And standing at the edge of those trees, she had drawn the figure, tall and thin and faceless, watching. If something was standing at the tree line every night watching your house, and it got a little closer each time, would you stay and try to understand what it wants, or would you move away immediately? Write your answer in the comments. Story 2. Man in the Hollow. The security camera footage shows something walking upright through my backyard at 3 in the morning, and the sounds it makes aren't human. I played the audio through every analysis program I can find, and nothing can identify the language it is speaking, because it isn't a language that exists anymore. My name is Derek Mason, and I am a software engineer who moved to rural Kentucky 6 months ago for the remote work lifestyle everyone talks about. I bought 15 acres in the Daniel Boone National Forest, built a small cabin, set up fiber internet, and thought I'd found paradise. Quiet, isolated, nothing but woods and wildlife for miles. I was wrong about the wildlife part. The locals in the nearest town, a place called Stillwater with maybe 200 people, were friendly enough when I first arrived. They helped me find contractors, recommended where to buy supplies, gave me advice on winterizing the cabin. But when I mentioned exactly where my property was, in a hollow off Route 192, their faces changed. Not scared exactly, more like resigned, like they knew something bad was going to happen and there was nothing they could do to stop it. An old man at the hardware store, maybe 75 with hands like tree bark, pulled me aside and asked if I'd heard about the Booger Man. I laughed, thought he was talking about the old Appalachian boogeyman story parents tell kids to keep them from wandering into the woods. But he wasn't joking. He told me the hollow where I built my cabin had been abandoned since the 1950s. That families who tried to settle there never lasted more than a season. Because something lives in those woods. Something that walks like a man but isn't one. Something that's been there longer than anyone can remember. I thanked him for the concern and drove home thinking about superstitious mountain folk and their ghost stories. That was my first mistake. My second was not leaving the moment I heard the sounds. It started 3 weeks after I moved in. I was working late, finishing a project deadline, when I heard something outside. Not an animal. Animals make sense. You can identify a deer, a coyote, a bear. This was different. It sounded like someone speaking, but the words were all wrong. Guttural, clicking, consonants that human mouths shouldn't be able to produce. I checked the security cameras I deinstalled around the property. Motion sensors, night vision, the whole setup. Nothing on screen, just empty forest. But I could still hear the sounds, closer now, circling the cabin. Then I smelled it, a stench like rotted meat mixed with wet fur and something else, something sharp and chemical that burned my nostrils. I locked every door and window, grabbed the shotgun I bought for protection against bears, and waited. The sounds continued for 3 hours. Moving around the cabin, testing. The motion sensors never triggered. Whatever was out there knew exactly where the cameras were pointed and stayed just outside their range. At dawn, it stopped. I went outside with the shotgun and found tracks. Bare footprints, human-shaped but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced. And they were huge, size 16 at least. The prints circled the cabin multiple times, approaching to within feet of the walls, then retreating back into the forest. I took photographs, measured them, posted on forums asking for identification. Most people said bear, but I see bear tracks. These weren't bear tracks. That night, I upgraded my security system, added more cameras with overlapping coverage, set up audio recorders. If something came back, I did have proof. It came back. 2 nights later, the motion sensors went off at 2 in the morning. I pulled up the camera feeds on my laptop and saw it. A figure moving through the trees at the edge of my property. Tall, maybe 7 feet, moving on 2 legs but hunched forward, arms hanging almost to its knees. The night vision made everything green and grainy, but I could see enough. It was naked, covered in hair or matted filth, hard to tell which. And it was watching my cabin, just standing there at the tree line, perfectly still, staring at my windows. Then it started making sounds, the same guttural language I'd heard before. But this time, I was recording high-quality audio that would capture every detail. It spoke for 20 minutes. Long strings of sounds that had patterns, structure, syntax. This wasn't random noise. This was communication. It was trying to tell me something. Then it walked closer, right up to the camera. Its face filled the frame. I spent hours staring at that footage, trying to understand what I saw. It had human features, eyes, nose, mouth. But everything was wrong. The proportions were off. The eyes were too far apart, set deep under a heavy brow ridge. The mouth was too wide, full of teeth that looked filed to points. And the expression wasn't blank or mindless. It was intelligent, calculating. It looked directly into the camera, reached out one long-fingered hand, and covered the lens. Every camera, one by one. It knew exactly where they were and methodically blocked each one. Then it approached the cabin. I could hear it on the porch, trying the door handle, scratching at the windows, making those sounds, those words in its impossible language. I called 911. The dispatcher took my information, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice. She said she'd send a deputy, but it would be at least 45 minutes. I was too far out, too isolated. The thing on my porch heard my voice on the phone. It went silent. Then it made a sound I'll never forget. A laugh, not human laughter, but something that served the same purpose. Mockery. It was laughing at me for calling for help. Then it left. I heard it crashing through the underbrush, moving away from the cabin and deeper into the forest. The deputy arrived an hour later. Young guy, probably late 20s, trying to look professional. I showed him the tracks, the damaged cameras, played the audio recording. He listened to maybe 30 seconds of the sounds, and his face went pale. He asked me what hollow I was in. When I told him, he nodded slowly. Then he told me a story. In 1952, a family named Pritchard tried to homestead in this exact area. They lasted 6 weeks. Something came out of the woods every night and terrorized them, killing their livestock, stealing tools, making sounds outside their cabin. The father went into the forest one night with a rifle, trying to chase it off. He came back 3 days later, walking out of the woods at dawn, completely naked and speaking gibberish. He never recovered, spent the rest of his life in an institution, drawing pictures of a man covered in hair and writing in a language that no linguist could identify. The deputy told me there were older stories too. Native American legends about a wild man who lived in the deepest hollows. A man who rejected humanity so long ago that he did become something else. Something primitive. The Cherokee called him different names, but the meaning was always the same. The man who forgot. He suggested I leave, sell the property, move back to civilization, but stubborn. I invested everything in this place. I wasn't to be chased off by some feral person living in the woods. That was 3 months ago. They learned a lot since then. The thing comes every few nights now. They've documented dozens of visits. It's always between midnight and dawn, always alone, and it is always trying to communicate. The sounds it makes are evolving, getting more complex, like it's learning, or maybe remembering. I sent the audio recordings to a linguistics professor at the University of Kentucky. She analyzed them for 2 weeks before calling me. Her voice was shaking. She said the sounds contained phonemes from multiple extinct languages: Proto-Germanic, Ancient Celtic, pre-Indo-European root words that shouldn't exist in the same linguistic structure. She asked where I recorded this. When I told her, she hung up, wouldn't return my calls. But she sent an email later, just 3 sentences. Don, to try to translate it. Don, to speak to it. Whatever is making those sounds ISN to human anymore, if it ever was. But I did try to translate it. I am a software engineer. Pattern recognition is what I do. I built an algorithm to analyze the recordings, identify repeated sounds, map the linguistic structure. It took 6 weeks, but I broke the code. Enough of it, anyway. And I wish I hadn't. The thing in the woods is telling a story. The same story, over and over, with slight variations. It is the story of a man who walked away from his village hundreds of years ago, who went into the forest and decided never to come back, who lived alone so long that he forgot how to be human, who watched generations of people come and go, building settlements and abandoning them, while he remained. But here is the terrifying part. The story is told from a perspective that spans centuries. It references events that happened in the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s. It talks about the changing of seasons hundreds of times over, about watching people age and die while remaining unchanged. This thing has been alive for at least 300 years, maybe longer, and it's lonely. That's what the sounds mean. That's what it has been trying to communicate. It wants contact, companionship. It has forgotten how to be human, but it remembers that it once was. And it is trying to find its way back. 2 weeks ago, it left something on my porch. A carved wooden figure, crude but recognizable as human. An offering, a gift. I made my next mistake. I took it inside. That night, the sounds were different. Excited, happy, if that word can apply to something like this. It had been trying to make contact, and I finally responded by accepting its gift. The next morning, I found more gifts. Animal bones arranged in patterns, stones stacked into cairns, bundles of herbs tied with grass. It was decorating my property, making it more like whatever home it remembers from centuries ago. And the sound started changing. It wasn't just telling me its story anymore. It was asking me questions. I could identify the rising intonation, the pauses waiting for response. It wanted me to answer, to participate in the conversation. I tried ignoring it, stopped accepting the gifts, threw the offerings into the woods. But that only made it worse. The sounds became angry, frustrated. It started approaching the cabin in daylight. I did look out the window and see it at the tree line. Watching, waiting. Last week, it took something of mine. A shirt I left on the porch to dry. I found it 3 days later, deep in the woods, hanging from a tree branch. And next to it was another carved figure. This one was wearing clothes made from leaves and bark. It was an invitation, a demonstration. It wants me to join it, to walk into the forest and become what it became, to forget humanity and live wild in these hills for the next 300 years. The deputy was right. I should leave, but I can not anymore, because I started understanding the language without my computer. When it speaks now, I know what it is saying. The sounds make sense. They are beautiful in a way I can explain. Ancient, pure, unfiltered by civilization. And I started responding. Not in English, in its language. The sounds come naturally now. My throat shapes them without effort. My tongue makes the clicks and stops that shouldn't be possible. Last night, I walked to the edge of my property. It was waiting there. We stood 30 feet apart, and we spoke. An actual conversation. It told me about the hollow in winter 300 years ago. About the deer herds that used to migrate through. About the stars before light pollution made them dim. And I told it about the world. About cities and computers and the things humanity has built. It listened with an expression I could finally read. Not confusion, pity. It thinks we lost something essential. That we traded our true nature for tools and walls and artificial light. That we were the ones who are lost, not it. Maybe it's right. I'm writing this on my laptop, but the words feel foreign. The keyboard feels wrong under my fingers. The screen hurts my eyes. I spent this morning walking in the woods, and it felt more natural than sitting in my cabin ever did. The thing is still out there. I can hear it now, making sounds that mean come, join, belong. And part of me wants to answer. Part of me wants to walk into those trees and never come back. My security cameras are still recording. If I disappear, they'll have footage. They will see me walking into the forest. They'll hear the sounds I am making. And maybe someone will translate them and understand that I didn't go against my will. I went because I was invited. Because something that has been alone for 3 centuries finally found someone who could understand its language. Who could hear its story? Who could make the choice it made so long ago? So here, it's my question. And I need you to really think about it. If you could walk away from everything, give up the modern world completely and live wild in the forest for the next 300 years. Never aging, never dying, but never being human again. Would you do it? Would you trade civilization for immortality? Write your answer in the comments, because I think the Boogerman is still out there. Still waiting, still looking for someone who is ready to forget. And maybe, just maybe, you will hear the sounds one night. And maybe you'll understand them. And when you do, you will have to make the same choice I'm making now. Story 3. What screams in the Tigard Valley? The sheep was hanging 20 feet up in a pine tree, and it had no head. I spotted it on my second morning hunting in the Tigard Valley, West Virginia. November 8th, opening day of rifle season, had been the day before, and I'd seen nothing but a few deers I didn't want to take. I was walking a ridgeline about 3 miles from my camp, scanning for buck sign, when something white caught my eye in the canopy above. At first I thought it was snow caught in the branches. Then I realized what I was looking at. A full-grown sheep, maybe 200 pounds, wedged into the fork of a pine tree. Its body was intact except for the head, which had been torn completely off. No blood on the ground below. No drag marks. Nothing to indicate how it got up there. I am 48 years old. I've been hunting these West Virginia mountains since I was 12. My grandfather taught me. His father taught him. 3 generations of my family have walked these ridges during deer season. I know these woods, know the wildlife, know what belongs and what doesn't. A headless sheep in a tree 20 feet off the ground doesn't belong. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, trying to work out what I was seeing. Black bears can climb, but they dawn to hunt sheep. And they dawn to cache kills in trees like that. Mountain lions will drag prey into trees, but they're haven to been confirmed mountain lions in West Virginia for over a century. And even if there were, they take their kills whole. They dawn to decapitate them first. The sheep's wool was matted with something dark and sticky. Not blood, something else. The texture looked wrong, too thick, and the smell that drifted down from the carcass made my stomach turn. Sweet and rotten at the same time, like meat that had been left out in the sun for days, but with an undertone of something chemical. Something that didn't belong in nature. I decided to move on. Whatever killed that sheep, I didn't want to meet it. I had another week of hunting ahead of me. Plenty of other ridges to explore. No reason to stay in an area where something was killing livestock in ways that made no sense. But as I walked away, I heard something behind me. A sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It started low, a rumble like distant thunder. Then it rose into something that I can only describe as a scream mixed with bleating. Like a sheep trying to imitate human speech, or a human trying to imitate a sheep. The sound was wrong on a level that bypassed my brain and went straight to the oldest parts of my nervous system. The parts that remember when humans were prey. I turned around slowly. The forest behind me was empty. Just trees and undergrowth and that headless sheep hanging in the canopy. But I could feel eyes on me. Multiple eyes, watching from somewhere I couldn't see. I backed away carefully, keeping my rifle ready, not turning my back until I could put 100 yards between myself and that pine tree. The Tigard Valley cuts through the heart of West Virginia. Steep mountains covered in dense hardwood and pine forests. Fast rivers cutting through limestone gorges. Remote, isolated. The kind of place where you can hunt for days without seeing another person. The kind of place where old stories persist. Stories about things that live in the deep woods. Things that aren't quite animal and aren't quite anything else. One of those stories involves something locals call the sheep squatch. First reported back in the 90s, though the Cherokee supposedly had older stories about something similar. Descriptions vary, but the core details are consistent. A creature standing 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in thick white or grayish fur, built like a bear but moving on 2 legs. And the head. Witnesses always mention the head. They say it looks like a sheep or ram. Elongated face, horns curving back from the skull, but with a mouth full of teeth that no herbivore should have. Fangs, predator teeth. Most people dismiss the stories as misidentified bears or folklore. I had dismissed them myself, until that morning in the Tigard Valley. I made it back to my camp around noon. I had set up in a clearing near Elkwater Fork, a small stream that fed into the Tigard River. My tent, my gear, my truck parked on a Forest Service road about a quarter-mile away. It was a good spot, sheltered, close to water, far enough from any trails that I wouldn't be disturbed by other hunters. But when I got back, something was wrong. My tent had been opened, not unzipped, torn. 3 long slashes ran down the side of the nylon, perfectly parallel, like claw marks. My sleeping bag had been pulled out and shredded. My food bag, which I had hung from a tree branch to keep it away from bears, was on the ground. The rope had been cut, not chewed through, cut, with something sharp enough to slice clean through quarter-inch cord. All my food was gone. Not scattered, gone, vanished completely, and in the dirt near my tent were tracks. I knelt down to examine them. They looked almost human, 5 toes, a heel, but they were huge, maybe 14 inches long and 6 inches wide, and the toes ended in what looked like claws, deep gouges in the soft earth where whatever made these tracks had dug in. The tracks led away from my camp, heading deeper into the forest, away from the service road, away from civilization, toward the high ridges where the forest became truly remote. I knew I should leave, pack up what was left of my gear, drive back to town, come back another year, but something kept me there. Pride, maybe, stubbornness, the refusal to be run off by some animal, no matter how strange. I spent the afternoon repairing my tent with duct tape and reorganizing my camp. I had a few protein bars in my truck, enough to get by for a day or two. I could hunt tomorrow, maybe bag a deer, have fresh meat. I convinced myself everything would be fine. This was just a weird incident. Bad luck, nothing more. But as the sun started setting, I heard that sound again. That scream bleat, echoing through the valley, coming from multiple directions. I realized with a cold certainty that there was more than one of these things. And they were communicating, calling to each other, coordinating. I built up my fire, fed it until the flames reached 6 feet high. Fire has protected humans from predators since the dawn of time. Whatever these things were, they would respect fire. They would stay away. I sat with my back against a tree, my rifle across my lap, and watched the darkness beyond my firelight. Waiting. Around midnight, I saw the first one. It appeared at the edge of my firelight, just standing there, watching me. And Jesus Christ, the stories didn't do it justice. It was massive, 8 feet tall at least, covered in thick white fur that seemed to shimmer in the firelight. The body was heavily muscled, built like something designed to kill. The arms hung long, ending in hands that looked almost human except for the claws. Black claws that curved like hooks. But the head was exactly what the stories described. Shaped like a ram, a skull, elongated, with 2 thick horns that curved back and then forward. The face was white fur over bone. And the eyes glowed orange in my firelight, not reflecting light like a deer or raccoon, actually glowing, producing their own illumination. Then it opened its mouth, the jaw unhinged like a snake, dropping impossibly wide. And the teeth, row after row of them, pointed, serrated, predator teeth in an herbivore, a skull. The creature screamed. That same sound I had heard earlier. Close up, it was even worse. The volume was painful. The pitch made my vision blur. And underneath the scream, I could hear something else, almost like words, almost like it was trying to form human speech but couldn't quite manage. I raised my rifle. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely aim. I put the crosshairs on that massive white chest and fired. The rifle cracked. The bullet hit. I saw the impact, saw the creature flinch. Then it was gone, vanished back into darkness so quickly I couldn't track the movement. Just there 1 second, gone the next. I reloaded with trembling fingers, scanned the darkness. Nothing. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Just my fire crackling and my own ragged breathing. Then I heard movement behind me. I spun around. Another one, this one even bigger, standing maybe 15 feet away. It had circled around while I was focused on the first one. This creature was old, I could tell by the scars covering its body, deep gouges in the white fur, old wounds that had healed into thick ridges. This thing had been fighting for a long time. Fighting and winning. And it was looking at me the way a cat looks at a mouse. Not with anger, with hunger, with certainty. I fired, missed, fired again, hit it in the shoulder. It screamed and charged. I had time to fire once more before it reached me. The bullet caught it in the chest. Center mass. Should have dropped it, should have torn through vital organs and ended the threat. The creature barely slowed. It crashed into me like a linebacker. I flew backward, hit the tree behind me hard enough to see stars. My rifle went flying into the darkness. The creature stood over me. I could smell it now. That same sweet rotten odor from the sheep carcass. Chemical and wrong. It reached down with one massive hand. The claws extended toward my face. I closed my eyes, waited for the end. This was it. Killed by something that shouldn't exist. Killed in a forest where no one would find my body for days or weeks. Then I heard an engine. Distant but getting closer. A vehicle on the Forest Service road. Someone else was out here. The creature, his head snapped toward the sound. It made a low growling noise. Then it turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, moving impossibly fast for something so large. Within seconds, the sound of its movement faded. It was gone. I lay there for a long time, too stunned to move, too terrified to believe I was still alive. Eventually, I managed to stand. Found my rifle in the dark. My fire had burned low. I fed it more wood. Built it back up. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat and watched and listened. The vehicle I heard never appeared. Maybe it had turned off somewhere else. Maybe I imagined it. But it had saved my life. At first light, I packed up what I could salvage. Left the rest. I walked to my truck and drove out of there. Didn't stop until I reached the first town. Called the Forest Service and reported the incident. Told them about the attacks. About the creatures. The ranger who took my call was polite but skeptical. Said they'd send someone to investigate. Asked if I'd been drinking. I hung up. I'd hunted a lot of places since then. Different states, different mountains. But I'd never gone back to the Tigard Valley. And I'd done research. Found dozens of other reports. Hikers who saw white shapes moving through the trees. Hunters who found mutilated livestock. Campers who heard those screams echoing through the night. The Forest Service dismisses most reports. Calls them misidentifications or hoaxes. But the people who've seen these things, we know the truth. Something lives in those mountains. Something that shouldn't exist by any rational understanding of biology. Something old and territorial and incredibly dangerous. The Sheepsquatch ISN, to a legend or a campfire story. It's real, and it is still out there. Still hunting. Still killing. Still watching from the darkness at the edge of the firelight. Would you go hunting alone in an area where people reported seeing an 8-foot creature with a sheep, his head and razor claws? Let me know in the comments. Story 4. Grafton Monster. I saw something along the Tigard River last month that should not exist. And now it is hunting me across 3 states. The thing had no head, but somehow it knew exactly where I was hiding. My name is Tom Bradley, and I'm a freelance photographer from Pittsburgh. I specialize in documenting abandoned industrial sites across Rust Belt America, places where factories once thrived and entire communities died slow, economic deaths. It pays well enough, and I enjoy the solitude of exploring forgotten corners of our country. That assignment in Grafton, West Virginia started like any other job. A regional magazine wanted photos of the old B&O railroad yards for an article about industrial decline. Grafton was once a major railroad hub, but like so many small towns in West Virginia, it had been hemorrhaging population since the mines and factories closed decades ago. I arrived on a gray October evening, driving through hills covered in dying autumn leaves. The town felt hollow, with too many empty storefronts and houses that needed paint they would never receive. The kind of place where young people leave as soon as they graduate high school and never look back. I checked into the only motel still operating, a rundown place called the Riverside Inn that sat near the Tigard River. The clerk was a woman in her 60s who looked at me with the suspicious friendliness small towns reserve for outsiders with cameras. When I mentioned I was photographing the old railroad yards, her expression changed completely. She leaned across the counter and lowered her voice, even though we were alone in the lobby. She told me to stay away from the river after dark. Something lived in those woods that had been taking people for decades, she said. Hunters who never came home. Fishermen whose boats were found empty, drifting downstream. She called it the Grafton Monster, and claimed it had been stalking the area since the 1960s. I thanked her politely and took my room key, dismissing her warnings as local folklore designed to add mystery to a dying town. Every rural community has its monster stories, usually involving Bigfoot or some variation of a mysterious creature that conveniently never leaves clear evidence of its existence. The next morning, I spent several hours photographing the abandoned railroad infrastructure. Rusted train cars sat on overgrown tracks, and the old roundhouse had partially collapsed under decades of neglect. The shots were exactly what the magazine wanted, capturing the melancholy beauty of industrial decay. But as I worked, I noticed something strange about the area. There were no birds, no squirrels or other small animals. The woods around the railroad yards were completely silent except for the wind through the trees and the distant sound of the Tygart River flowing past. That silence felt unnatural, oppressive, as if something had driven away every living creature that could flee. I had photographed dozens of abandoned sites, and wildlife usually reclaimed these places quickly once human activity stopped. But here, nature itself seemed afraid to return. I finished my work by late afternoon and decided to scout locations for sunrise shots the next day. A trail led from the railroad yards down to the riverbank, where I hoped to capture some images of the water reflecting the morning light. The path was overgrown but clearly still used occasionally. I found fresh footprints in the mud, boots that looked to be size 12 or 13. Nothing unusual about that, except the footprints were accompanied by something else. Long gouges in the soft earth, as if claws had scraped the ground with each step. The prints led to a clearing beside the river where someone had built a crude shelter from branches and tarps. But the shelter was too large for any human occupant. The entrance was at least 8 feet high, and the interior space could have housed a small truck. Empty cans and food packages littered the ground around the shelter, but they were opened in a strange way. Torn apart rather than properly opened, as if whatever lived there lacked the fine motor control needed to operate a can opener or tear along perforated lines. I photographed the scene, thinking it might be evidence of a homeless encampment or perhaps someone playing elaborate pranks on the locals. But the scale of everything was wrong for human habitation. The shelter was too big, the claw marks too deep, and the destroyed food containers suggested something with immense strength and limited intelligence. That evening, I developed the photos in my motel room and noticed something I had missed at the scene. In the background of one image, barely visible among the trees, was a pale shape that might have been a large animal standing upright on 2 legs. I enlarged the image as much as possible, but the figure remained frustratingly unclear. It appeared to be humanoid but wrong somehow, with proportions that did not match any known animal. The torso was massive, the arms too long, and there seemed to be no distinct head above the shoulders. I convinced myself it was a trick of light and shadow, a coincidental arrangement of branches that created the illusion of a creature. But something about the image made my hands shake as I handled the photograph. That night, I woke to sounds outside my motel room, heavy footsteps in the gravel parking lot, circling the building slowly and deliberately. The footsteps were accompanied by a low humming sound, almost musical but with an electronic quality that reminded me of power lines in the rain. I looked through the window blinds but saw nothing except empty parking spaces and the dark tree line beyond. The sounds continued for nearly an hour, always moving, never stopping in one place long enough for me to get a clear view of whatever was making them. The next morning, I found deep impressions in the gravel outside my room. The prints were roughly human-shaped but enormous, at least 16 inches long and 6 inches wide. More disturbing were the claw marks surrounding each print, gouging the asphalt in patterns that suggested a creature with 4-inch talons on each finger. I measured and photographed the prints, then drove to the local police station to report what I had found. The officer on duty listened politely but with obvious skepticism until I showed him the photographs. His expression changed when he saw the images of the prints and the makeshift shelter by the river. He told me I was not the first person to find evidence of something unusual in the woods near Grafton. Over the past 60 years, there had been dozens of reports of a large, glowing creature spotted along the Tygart River. Witnesses consistently described it as humanoid but headless, with pale skin that seemed to emit its own light. Most sightings occurred at night, usually involving people who were alone in the woods. The creature never attacked directly but seemed to stalk observers from a distance, following them for miles through the forest before disappearing without explanation. 3 people had vanished completely while camping or hiking in the area. Their bodies were never found, but searchers had discovered campsites destroyed with incredible violence, as if something with enormous strength had torn apart tents and equipment in a rage. The officer advised me to leave Grafton immediately and not return to the river alone. He said the state wildlife department had investigated the reports multiple times but never found concrete evidence of an unknown species. However, they had documented the complete absence of normal wildlife in a 2-mile radius around the railroad yards, something that suggested the presence of an apex predator that other animals instinctively avoided. I should have listened to his warning and driven back to Pittsburgh that afternoon. Instead, I decided to return to the river one more time, hoping to capture definitive photographic evidence of whatever was living in those woods. That decision nearly cost me my life. I waited until dusk and positioned myself in the tree line overlooking the creature, his shelter. I had my best camera with a telephoto lens, hoping to photograph the thing if it returned after dark. The plan was to observe from a safe distance and leave immediately if I felt threatened. As darkness fell, the forest became completely silent. Even the sound of the river seemed muffled, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The temperature dropped rapidly, and a strange mist began rising from the water. Then I saw the glow. A pale, greenish light emerged from the woods downstream, moving slowly toward the shelter. As it approached, I could see that the light was coming from the skin of a massive humanoid figure walking upright on 2 legs. The creature was at least 8 feet tall with impossibly broad shoulders and arms that hung nearly to its knees. But where its head should have been, there was nothing except smooth skin that extended directly from the shoulders to form a seamless, necklace torso. The glowing skin pulsed rhythmically, like a massive heartbeat made visible. The light was bright enough to illuminate the trees around the creature, casting moving shadows that danced across the forest floor. I began photographing frantically, using the camera as silent mode to avoid making any sound. Through the telephoto lens, I could see details that made my stomach turn. The creature's skin was not naturally pale but appeared to be covered with some kind of luminescent fungus or bacterial infection that had replaced its normal pigmentation. Where its eyes should have been, there were 2 dark pits in what remained of its face, sunken hollows that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its mouth was a horizontal slash beneath these voids, far too wide for any human face and filled with teeth that looked more like broken glass than bone. The creature moved with surprising grace despite its size, examining the contents of its shelter and sorting through the scattered debris. It handled objects with long, clawed fingers that seemed to have too many joints, bending in ways that human anatomy would not allow. As I watched through the camera lens, the creature suddenly stopped moving and turned in my direction. Even without visible eyes, I knew it was looking directly at me. The glow from its skin intensified, and the humming sound I had heard the night before began emanating from somewhere deep in its chest. I realized with growing terror that the creature was not just aware of my presence but had probably known I was there from the moment I entered the woods. It had been performing for my benefit, allowing me to observe and photograph it for reasons I could not understand. The thing began walking toward my hiding place with deliberate, measured steps. Each footfall shook the ground, and the humming grew louder and more complex, taking on harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. I ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or safety. I sprinted toward the trail that led back to the railroad yards. Behind me, I could hear the creature following, its massive body moving through the forest with increasing speed. The glow from its skin turned the night around me into a shifting landscape of green light and black shadows. Trees looked like twisted giants reaching down to grab me, and every root and fallen log became an obstacle that threatened to send me tumbling into the path of my pursuer. I reached my car and drove away from Grafton without stopping at the motel to collect my belongings. In my rearview mirror, I could see the pale glow among the trees, watching me leave but making no attempt to follow me onto the road. That was 3 weeks ago, and I thought I had escaped whatever lived in those West Virginia woods. But the creature was not finished with me. 2 days after I returned to Pittsburgh, I woke to find large footprints in the mud around my apartment building. The same impossible prints I had photographed in Grafton, 16 inches long with deep claw marks surrounding them. The creature had followed me home. Over the next week, the signs of its presence became undeniable. My neighbors complained about strange sounds at night, describing the same electronic humming I had heard by the river. Security cameras in my building malfunctioned whenever they pointed toward the parking lot, producing only static or strange, pulsing patterns of light. I started staying in hotels, moving every few nights and paying with cash to avoid creating a trail the creature could follow. But somehow it always found me. No matter where I went, I would wake to find those massive footprints outside my window and that terrible humming echoing through the walls. Last week, I drove to my sister's house in Cleveland, hoping that distance and the presence of other people would provide some protection. The creature arrived the same night, stalking the suburban streets with its skin glowing like a walking nightmare. My sister's security system recorded 4 hours of footage showing a tall, luminescent figure circling her house, pressing what should have been its face against the windows and leaving massive handprints on the glass. The next morning, we found her garden destroyed, every plant torn up by the roots and arranged in patterns that looked almost like symbols or messages. I know now that the Grafton monster is not just some unknown animal or misidentified bear. It is something intelligent and malevolent, something that marks its territory by driving away other forms of life and claims ownership of anyone who witnesses its existence. The photographs I took that night by the river have developed strange properties. The images seem to move when I am not looking directly at them, and the creature, this glowing skin pulses in rhythm with my own heartbeat when I study the pictures too closely. I have tried destroying the photos, but they reappear in my camera and on my computer no matter how many times I delete them. The creature has somehow used those images to create a connection between us, a supernatural link that allows it to track me anywhere I go. Yesterday, I received a call from the Grafton police. 3 more people had vanished near the Tygart River, and investigators found my business card at one of the destroyed campsites. They wanted to know if I had returned to the area or shared information about the creature, its location with other photographers. I had not been back to Grafton, but the creature had clearly been active since my encounter. It was taking more people, becoming bolder and more aggressive, and somehow I was connected to its increasing violence. Tonight, I can see the pale glow approaching through the fog outside this highway motel in rural Ohio. The electronic humming is getting louder, and I know the creature has found me again. But this time, I think it has come to finish what started when I first photographed its existence. The Grafton monster is not just hunting me anymore. It is transforming me, turning me into something like itself through our supernatural connection. My skin has begun developing the same pale luminescence, and I can feel changes happening inside my body that I do not understand. Soon I will return to the woods along the Tygart River, not as a photographer documenting an unknown creature, but as something new and terrible that glows in the darkness and hunts anyone foolish enough to seek evidence of its existence. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some creatures should never be photographed. And some places in America hold secrets that are far more dangerous than the economic decline and industrial decay I thought I was documenting. The light is getting brighter now, and the humming has become a song I finally understand. It is calling me home to West Virginia, where headless things walk among the abandoned railroad yards and claim ownership of anyone brave enough or foolish enough to witness their impossible existence. The transformation is almost complete. Story 5. Black-eyed children of Cades Cove. The pale boy in the perfect Sunday suit tapped on my car window at 3 a.m., and when I looked into his eyes, I saw nothing but endless black void. He could not have been more than 10 years old, standing alone in the foggy darkness of Cades Cove with his blonde hair neatly combed and his clothes looking like they had been pressed that morning. But those eyes were wrong, completely black from edge to edge, like someone had filled them with oil and sealed them shut. And when he smiled and asked if I could give him a ride, every survival instinct I possessed started screaming at me to drive away as fast as possible. My name is Mark Stevens, and I am a wildlife photographer from Nashville. I had come to Great Smoky Mountains National Park to capture dawn shots of the historic buildings in Cades Cove, planning to spend the night in my SUV to get the perfect morning light on the old homesteads and churches that dot the 11-mile loop road. Cades Cove was once a thriving mountain community, home to nearly 700 residents who farmed the fertile valley surrounded by ancient peaks. But when the national park was established in 1934, the government bought out all the families and moved them off their ancestral land. The settlement was abandoned, left to become a tourist attraction showcasing how people lived in the Appalachian wilderness before modern civilization arrived. Most of the original buildings are gone now, rotted away or demolished decades ago. But a few structures remain, preserved as historical monuments to a way of life that vanished when progress came to the mountains. The primitive Baptist church still stands near the middle of the loop, its plain wooden pews and simple pulpit exactly as they were when the last congregation held services in 1915. I had photographed the church many times during daylight hours, but I wanted to capture it in the ethereal light of early morning, when mist rises from the valley floor and the ancient mountains seem to glow with their own inner fire. So I parked my SUV in the gravel lot beside the church and settled in for a long night of waiting. The first few hours passed peacefully. I dozed in my driver's seat, occasionally waking to check the eastern sky for signs of approaching dawn. The cove was completely silent except for the distant sound of Abrams Creek flowing through the valley and the occasional call of a screech owl hunting in the darkness. But around 2 a.m., the atmosphere began to change. The temperature inside my vehicle dropped noticeably, even though my thermometer showed no change in the outside air. My breath started fogging despite the warm October night, and frost began forming on the inside of my windows like I was parked in a freezer instead of a Tennessee valley. That was when I saw the first child. She appeared at the edge of my headlight beams, a girl maybe 8 years old wearing a white dress that looked like it belonged in a different century. Her dark hair was arranged in careful ringlets that framed a face so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness. She stood perfectly still beside the old church, watching my vehicle with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my camera and tried to focus on her through the windshield, thinking I had stumbled onto some kind of historical reenactment or educational program. But when I looked through the viewfinder, the girl was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never been there at all. More children began appearing over the next hour, materializing from the darkness like moths drawn to my headlights. Boys and girls ranging in age from maybe 6 to 12, all dressed in old-fashioned clothing that looked freshly cleaned and pressed. They gathered around the historic church in small groups, perfectly silent, all of them watching my SUV with the same unblinking stare. But I could never get a clear photograph of any of them. Every time I raised my camera, they would vanish the moment I looked through the lens, only to reappear seconds later in slightly different positions. It was as if they existed only in my peripheral vision, creatures that could not survive direct observation. The children began moving closer to my vehicle around 3 a.m., abandoning their vigil around the church to approach my parking spot with slow, deliberate steps. Their movements were too coordinated, too purposeful for normal kids exploring in the dark. They walked like they shared a single mind, following invisible instructions that guided them toward some common goal. That was when the boy in the Sunday suit stepped out of the fog and walked directly to my driver's side window. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, approaching my SUV like he had every right to be there. His clothes were immaculate despite the damp night air, his blonde hair perfectly styled, his pale skin smooth and unblemished. He looked like a child from a 1950s family portrait, except for those horrible black eyes that reflected my headlights like mirrors made of shadow. The boy raised his small hand and tapped politely on my window, 3 soft knocks that somehow carried more authority than any adult command. When I did not respond immediately, he tapped again, more insistently, and I could see his lips moving as if he was speaking words I could not hear through the glass. Every instinct I possessed told me not to roll down that window. But curiosity and social conditioning battled against my fear, the normal human impulse to help a lost child warring with the growing certainty that this was no ordinary situation. The boy looked so young, so helpless standing there in his perfect clothes. That part of me felt guilty for being afraid. I cracked the window just enough to hear what he was saying, telling myself I could slam it shut again if anything seemed wrong. The boy, his voice was clear and polite, with the careful diction of someone who had been taught proper manners from an early age. He asked if I could give him a ride to town, explaining that he and his friends had gotten lost during their evening walk and needed help getting home. His words were perfectly reasonable, exactly what you might expect from a well-behaved child in trouble. But underneath the polite request was something else, an undertone that made my blood run cold despite the innocent explanation. It was not what he said but how he said it, with the absolute confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. There was no pleading in his voice, no uncertainty or fear. Just a calm assumption that I would do exactly what he asked, as if my compliance was already a foregone conclusion. I looked past him and saw the other children had formed a loose circle around my SUV, blocking any possible escape route. They stood motionless in the darkness, their pale faces turned toward my vehicle, their black eyes reflecting my taillights like tiny mirrors. None of them seemed concerned about being stranded in the middle of a national park at 3 a.m., far from any town or settlement. The boy tapped on my window again, more firmly this time, and repeated his request with growing impatience. He wanted me to unlock the doors and let him inside my vehicle, along with his friends who needed transportation back to civilization. It was a reasonable request from what appeared to be children in distress, but something deep in my primitive brain was screaming warnings about the danger of compliance. I had heard stories about the black-eyed children, urban legends that had been circulating online for years. Tales of pale kids with impossible eyes who appeared in isolated locations, always asking for rides or permission to enter homes and vehicles. According to the stories, anyone who agreed to their requests was never seen again, vanishing as completely as if they had been erased from existence. But these were just internet ghost stories, modern folklore created by people with too much time and too much imagination. The children outside my SUV were probably just local kids playing an elaborate prank, using contact lenses to create the black eye effect and counting on the isolated location to make their performance more convincing. Except that no normal children would be wandering around Cades Cove at 3 a.m., miles from the nearest town, dressed in antique clothing that looked like museum pieces. And no pranksters could make the temperature drop 20 degrees just by approaching my vehicle, or create the overwhelming sense of dread that was making my hands shake and my heart race. The boy pressed his face closer to my window, and I could see my reflection in those black eyes, distorted and stretched like I was looking into a funhouse mirror made of shadow. His breath fogged the glass despite the warm night, and I noticed that the condensation formed patterns that looked almost like letters in a language I did not recognize. He asked again for a ride, but this time his voice carried an edge of command that made it clear he was not really asking. This was a demand disguised as a request, delivered with the absolute authority of someone accustomed to having their wishes granted immediately. The politeness was just a thin veneer over something much darker and more dangerous. I realized then that I was not dealing with lost children or elaborate pranksters. These were something else entirely, entities that wore the appearance of harmless kids but possessed an alien intelligence that had nothing to do with human childhood. They had chosen this form because children are naturally sympathetic, because adults are programmed to protect and assist young people in distress. But underneath their innocent exteriors was something predatory and patient, something that had been perfecting this hunting strategy for far longer than internet legends suggested. The black-eyed children were not a modern phenomenon but an ancient threat that had learned to adapt to changing times, using our protective instincts against us. I started my engine and put the SUV in drive, but the boy placed his small hand flat against my window and shook his head with calm disapproval. The other children moved closer, no longer maintaining their circle but pressing in around my vehicle like a pack of predators closing in for the kill. Their black eyes reflected my headlights, creating a constellation of tiny stars in the darkness. The boy spoke again, and this time I could hear the threat beneath his polite words. He was not asking for a ride anymore but informing me that I would provide transportation whether I wanted to or not. The choice had never been mine to make. From the moment I rolled down my window, I had already agreed to their terms. But I had not unlocked my doors, and something told me that was the only thing standing between me and whatever fate awaited those who fully cooperated with the black-eyed children. They needed permission to enter, required some form of consent before they could complete whatever transformation they had planned for me. I floored the accelerator and felt the SUV lurch forward, but we moved only a few feet before the engine died despite showing a full tank of gas. The electrical systems flickered and failed, leaving me in complete darkness except for the faint starlight filtering through the fog. My cell phone was dead, my radio silent, my GPS screen blank. The children began to change as modern technology abandoned me, their innocent facades shifting to reveal the true nature of whatever wore those small bodies. Their skin grew even paler, becoming translucent enough to show dark veins beneath the surface. Their perfect clothing began to fade and tatter, revealing the age and decay that had been hidden by supernatural illusion. But their eyes remained the same, endless black voids that seemed to pull at my vision like miniature black holes. They were not eyes at all but windows into some other realm, portals to a darkness so complete that looking into them too long might drag my consciousness across the threshold into whatever waited on the other side. The boy smiled, and I saw that his teeth were too sharp, too numerous for any human mouth. He pressed harder against my window, and hairline cracks began to spread across the glass like a spider web of fractures. The barrier between us was failing, and once it broke completely, nothing would prevent him from reaching inside to claim what he had come for. I understood then why Cades Cove had really been abandoned in 1934. The government had not relocated those mountain families to make room for a national park. They had evacuated the area because something ancient and hungry had taken up residence in the valley, something that fed on human beings and used the appearance of children to lure victims into its grasp. The original settlers had known about the black-eyed children, had passed down warnings through generations of mountain families who learned to avoid certain areas after dark. But when outsiders came to establish the park, they dismissed such stories as backwoods superstition and ignored the advice of people who had lived with the danger for decades. The window finally shattered, and cold air flooded into my SUV along with the smell of something that had been dead for a very long time. The boy reached through the broken glass with fingers that were too long, too jointed, stretching toward me with supernatural flexibility. His touch was ice cold, and where his skin brushed mine, I could feel sensation draining away like blood flowing from an open wound. But just as his fingers closed around my wrist, the first light of dawn appeared over the eastern mountains, and the black-eyed children began to retreat. They moved backward in perfect synchronization, their forms becoming less solid as natural light replaced the artificial illumination of my failed headlights. The boy released my wrist and stepped away from the SUV, his black eyes reflecting the growing light like mirrors that could not be broken. He smiled one last time, showing those rows of impossible teeth, and spoke a final word that sounded like a promise and a threat combined. Then the children faded into the morning mist, vanishing as completely as if they had never existed. My SUV started normally, my phone came back to life, my GPS resumed its cheerful guidance toward the park exit. But my wrist bore 5 small bruises where the boy had touched me, marks that would never fully heal. I drove straight home to Nashville and never returned to Cades Cove. But I know the black-eyed children are still there, waiting in the abandoned valley for the next photographer or tourist or curious visitor who might be willing to give them a ride. They are patient hunters, ancient predators who have learned that the best traps are baited with innocence and desperation. The old mountain families knew to avoid them, but that knowledge died when the government relocated the original residents. Now the black-eyed children hunt in a nature preserve, protected by laws and regulations that prevent anyone from disturbing their feeding ground. If you visit Cades Cove, stay on the marked trails during daylight hours. Do not linger after sunset. Do not investigate strange children who appear in historical photographs, and never, under any circumstances, agree to give anyone a ride if they approach your vehicle in the darkness. The black-eyed children are still asking politely for assistance, still using our protective instincts against us, still waiting for someone foolish enough to unlock their doors and invite the darkness inside. Story 6. Red eyes over Route 2. I should have turned back the moment I saw the feathers. They were scattered across the center line of Route 2, just outside Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Big feathers. Too big. Each one was maybe 2 feet long, black as coal tar, and they caught my headlights in a way that made them look almost wet. I slowed my truck to a crawl, studying them through the windshield. The date was November 13th, 1967. I was 41 years old. I had driven this stretch of highway 1,000 times in my life, delivering machine parts up and down the Ohio River Valley. I thought I knew every pothole, every curve, every weird quirk of that Appalachian backroad. But I had never seen anything like those feathers. I should have turned back, but I needed to make my delivery by morning, and the Silver Bridge was the only crossing for 30 miles. So I kept driving, my tires crunching over those massive black plumes, and I tried to convince myself they came from some kind of large bird. A turkey, maybe, or a vulture, even though I knew, deep in the ancient part of my brain that still remembers when humans were prey, that no natural bird left feathers like that. The radio had been acting strange all evening. Static mostly, with occasional bursts of what sounded like distant voices speaking in a language I couldn't quite place. Not Spanish, not any European tongue I recognized. The cadence was wrong, the vowels too long, the consonants clicking in ways human mouths shouldn't make. Every few miles, the static would clear for just a moment, and I would hear a woman, this voice, calm and emotionless, reciting numbers. Just numbers. No context. 37, 46, 12, 22, then back to static. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the Ohio Valley had heard them by that November. Starting back in November of '66, exactly 1 year earlier, people around Point Pleasant had been reporting something they called the Mothman. A creature, a thing. Descriptions varied, but the core details remained consistent across dozens of witnesses. Something tall, maybe 7 feet, with huge wings that folded against its body. Gray or brown skin, muscular and wrong. No neck to speak of, the head sitting directly on the shoulders. And eyes, red eyes that glowed in the dark like hot coals, eyes that people said followed you, understood you, looked into you in ways that made grown men break down crying. Most of the sightings happened at night, along deserted roads or near the old TNT plant north of town. The plant had been built during World War II to manufacture explosives, then abandoned after the war ended, leaving behind miles of concrete tunnels, empty igloos, and contaminated earth that nothing would grow on. Local kids called it the TNT area. It had become a popular spot for parking, despite or maybe because of its reputation for strangeness. Several young couples had encountered the creature there. One pair, Roger and Linda Scarberry, had been driving through the TNT area when something massive rose up behind their car. They described wings unfolding, a creature lifting off the ground and chasing them at speeds over 100 miles per hour. They made it to the police station in town, hysterical, insisting something had pursued them for miles. The deputy who took their report believed them. He had seen the terror in their eyes. More sightings followed. A woman hanging laundry saw it perched on her roof. A man walking his dog watched it rise from a field, wings blocking out the stars. 2 volunteer firemen spotted it standing in the middle of Route 7, those red eyes fixed on their approaching truck. When they got within 50 yards, it spread its wings and lifted straight up into the night sky, vanishing into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light itself. I had dismissed the stories as small-town hysteria, misidentified birds, mass delusion, maybe some prankster in a costume. The human mind sees patterns in chaos, finds monsters in shadows. I was a practical man. I believed in carburetors and steel and roads that went from point A to point B. I did not believe in prophecies or omens or creatures that defied natural law. But as I drove deeper into the West Virginia hills that night, my truck laboring up steep grades and coasting down into hollow valleys where the darkness felt thick as mud, I found my certainty beginning to crack. The feathers had bothered me more than I wanted to admit, and the radio, with its strange static and stranger voices, made the cab of my truck feel less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see something behind me. The road was empty, always empty, just my headlights cutting through November fog and the white line disappearing under my hood. Around 9:30, I passed through a tiny crossroads called Henderson. Just a gas station and a diner, both closed for the night. A single streetlight threw weak yellow illumination across cracked pavement. As I rolled through the intersection, my headlights swept across something standing at the edge of the tree line. I had an impression of size, of impossible height, of wings folded tight. Then it was gone, and I was past, and I told myself it had been a shadow. A trick of light and fog, my mind filling empty darkness with imagined shape. But my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The numbers on the radio continued. 46, 12, 18, 22. The woman, this voice never changed inflection, never paused for breath. Just numbers, endless numbers, and I found myself listening for patterns, trying to extract meaning from the sequence. Were they coordinates? Dates? Some kind of code? The static between transmissions had taken on a rhythmic quality, almost like breathing. Deep inhalations followed by long exhales. I reached to turn the radio off, then stopped. The silence in the cab felt worse than the static. At least the radio was familiar. At least it was human, even if the broadcast was strange. I crested a hill and Point Pleasant spread out below me, lights reflecting off the black water of the Ohio River. The Silver Bridge connected West Virginia to Ohio, a graceful suspension span that had stood since 1928. I could see cars crossing it, tiny points of light moving from one shore to the other. The bridge was the town, this lifeline, the only direct route to the Ohio side for miles in either direction. 17,000 people crossed it every day. I would be one of them in a few minutes. The road descended toward the river valley. Forest pressed close on both sides, dense Appalachian hardwood that even in winter maintained an oppressive quality. The bare branches interlocking overhead like the roof of a cathedral built for a god with no love for human beings. Fog pooled in the low spots, and my truck pushed through it like a boat through water. I was maybe 2 miles from the bridge when I saw the eyes. They appeared in my rearview mirror, 2 points of red light, maybe 100 yards back, hovering about 7 feet off the ground. At first, I thought another truck was following me with strange taillights. But the lights didn't debob or sway with the movement of the vehicle. They remained perfectly steady, perfectly level, keeping exact pace with my speed. When I accelerated, they accelerated. When I slowed, they slowed, always maintaining that 100-yard distance, always at the same height. My mouth went dry. I pressed the gas pedal harder, my old Ford groaning as the speedometer climbed past 60, then 70. The road was twisting, dangerous at this speed, But I didn't care. I needed to reach the bridge, reach lights and people and the safety of crowds. The red eyes kept pace effortlessly. At 80 miles per hour, on a road barely wide enough for two vehicles, through fog thick enough to cut, those eyes never wavered, never fell behind. The radio went dead. Not static, dead. Complete silence that seemed to have weight and presence. And in that silence, I heard something else. A sound from outside the truck. From above, the rhythmic whoosh of something large moving through air. Wings. Beating wings, keeping time with my heartbeat. I risked a glance up through the windshield. Nothing but darkness and fog. But the sound was unmistakable now, loud enough to hear over the engine, over the wind, over my own ragged breathing. Something was flying above my truck. Something huge, and those red eyes in my mirror were getting closer. The bridge appeared around a curve, its lights a welcome beacon. I could see the steel suspension cables, the concrete towers, the roadway stretching across dark water. Safety was maybe a quarter mile away. I pushed the accelerator to the floor. The old Ford shuddered but responded, giving me everything it had. 90 miles per hour, the fastest I had ever driven. The red eyes were 50 yards back now. 30, 20. I shot onto the bridge approach. Streetlights surrounded me. I could see other cars ahead. Normal people living normal lives, unaware of what pursued me out of the Appalachian darkness. The red eyes stopped at the bridge entrance. They hovered there for a moment, maybe 10 yards behind my truck, close enough that I could see they were not lights. They were eyes, actual eyes, impossibly large, filled with an intelligence that was vast and cold and completely alien to human understanding. Then they rose, straight up into the night sky, ascending so fast they became stars, then vanished. The sound of wings faded. The radio crackled back to life, and a country station played Patsy Cline, normal and mundane and beautiful in its ordinariness. I made it across the bridge that night. I delivered my parts. I tried to forget what I had seen, but the numbers the radio had been broadcasting stuck in my mind. 46, 12, 18, 22. I wrote them down on a scrap of paper, not sure why, just feeling like they were important. Like they were trying to tell me something. 5 weeks later, on December 15th, 1967, at 4:58 in the afternoon, during rush hour traffic, the Silver Bridge collapsed. The suspension chains failed. The entire span dropped into the Ohio River in less than a minute. 46 people died, 12 vehicles went into the water, 18 bodies were never recovered, 22 children lost parents that day. The numbers had been a countdown, a prophecy delivered in the most sterile, inhuman way possible. And the creature with red eyes, the thing people called Mothman, had been trying to warn us. Or maybe just observing, watching as we drove obliviously toward disaster, marking us the way a farmer marks cattle before slaughter. I never drove Route 2 again. I never crossed another suspension bridge without thinking about steel failing, about cables snapping, about water waiting below. The official investigation blamed corrosion and metal fatigue. They said the bridge was old, past its safe lifespan, that tragedy was inevitable given lack of maintenance and increasing traffic. They were probably right. Bridges don't need supernatural explanations to fail. But I know what I saw that November night. I know what followed me out of those dark Appalachian hills. And I know those red eyes were the eyes of something that exists outside our comfortable explanations. Something that watches from places we pretend are empty. Something that sometimes, for reasons we cannot understand, tries to tell us what is coming. I am 78 now. Point Pleasant built a statue of Mothman downtown. Tourists come to take pictures with it. The town embraced the legend, turned tragedy into commerce. Maybe that is healthy. Maybe that is how we cope with the inexplicable. We make it familiar. We make it manageable. We put it on t-shirts and coffee mugs. But late at night, when I can sleep, I sometimes turn on my old radio and scan through static, listening for that woman, his voice reciting numbers. Listening for warnings I don't want to hear. Listening for prophecies I can prevent. The static is always there. Sometimes, if I listen long enough, I hear those rhythmic exhalations, like breathing, like wings beating in darkness too deep to measure. The red eyes are still out there, still watching, still waiting for the next disaster they can neither prevent nor ignore. And sometimes I wonder, what numbers are they broadcasting now? What countdown have we already started that we are too blind or too stubborn or too afraid to acknowledge? What do you think those red eyes really were? Write your answer in the comments below. Story 7. Thing on Braxton Hill. I never believed in monsters until September 12, 1952. The night I watched something that wasn't a human glide across the grass on my family's farm in Flatwoods, West Virginia. What I saw that night changed me forever. And I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, because the official story, the one they fed to newspapers and television crews, was a lie designed to keep people calm. The truth is so much worse. My name is Eugene Lemon, and I was 17 years old when I became part of something that the government wanted buried. Most people think they know the Flatwoods monster story, but they don't. They know the sanitized version, the one that makes it sound like mass hysteria or a barn owl caught in the headlights. I'm here to tell you what really happened on that hill, and why I haven't had a full night's sleep in over 70 years. It started just after 7 in the evening. The sun had dropped behind the ridgeline, painting the sky that particular shade of purple that happens in Appalachia right before true darkness settles in. I was walking home from the Smith's place when I heard the boys shouting. Eddie May, his younger brothers, Neil and Teddy, were running toward me with 3 of their friends, all of them pointing up at the sky and hollering about a meteor. But it wasn't moving like any meteor I'd ever seen. The object was bright red, pulsing like a heartbeat, and it was descending in a controlled arc toward the Fisher farm on Braxton Hill. I hunted those woods my entire life. I knew every deer path, every hollow, every limestone outcropping. The thought of something crashing up there sent a spike of excitement through me. We heard stories on the radio about flying saucers, about things the Air Force couldn't explain. This was our chance to see something incredible. Eddie, its mother, Kathleen May, came out onto her porch when she heard the commotion. She was a practical woman, sturdy and no nonsense, the kind who could birth a calf and cook Sunday dinner without breaking stride. When we told her what we'd seen, she didn't dismiss us. Instead, she grabbed a flashlight and said if we were going up that hill, she was coming too. I think she thought it might be a plane crash, that someone might need help. I wish to God we stayed home. We started up the hill around 7:30, following the old logging road that wound through the oak and maple trees. My dog, a German shepherd named Richie, ran ahead of us, nose to the ground, tail wagging. The air smelled wrong as we climbed. It had that metallic tang you get before a thunderstorm, but the sky was clear. There was something else too, a sickly sweet odor underneath, like rotting vegetation mixed with burnt plastic. None of us had ever smelled anything like it. About halfway up, Richie stopped dead, his ears flattened against his skull, and he started whimpering, a sound I never heard him make. This was a dog who faced down black bears without flinching. When I called to him, he tucked his tail and bolted back down the hill, disappearing into the darkening woods. That should have been our warning. Animals know things we don't. They can sense wrongness in the air, in the way reality bends around certain presences. We reached the top of the hill just as full darkness fell. The Fisher property was abandoned. Had been for years since Old Man Fisher died and his children moved to Ohio. The farmhouse stood empty, windows dark, surrounded by overgrown fields. My flashlight beam cut through the mist that was rising from the ground, thicker than it should have been for September. That smell was overwhelming now, making my eyes water and my throat burn. Then Neil screamed and pointed toward the tree line. My flashlight swung in that direction, and for a moment, my brain couldn't process what it was seeing. There was a light, about 30 yards away, pulsing with that same red glow we'd seen in the sky. But it wasn't on the ground. It was hovering maybe 3 feet up, partially obscured by the low-hanging branches of a massive oak tree. I took a step closer, and that is when the boys started backing up, their voices rising in panic. The light wasn't alone. There was something next to it, something that my mind kept trying to interpret as a person in strange clothing, but the proportions were all wrong. It was at least 9 feet tall, maybe closer to 10, with what looked like a pointed hood or helmet that glowed faintly in the darkness. The body beneath was massive, draped in dark pleated fabric that seemed to float independently of the wind. Mrs. May grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. She was making a sound low in her throat, not quite a scream, more like the noise someone makes when their body recognizes danger before their mind catches up. I raised the flashlight higher, and that is when the thing turned to face us. I need you to understand something. When I say it had a face, I am using that word because I don't have another one. What I saw in that circle of flashlight beam wasn't a face in any human sense. It was a window into something wrong, something that violated the basic laws of how things should be. There were two large circular openings where eyes should have been, glowing orange from within, but there was nothing behind them. No intelligence. No recognition, just that awful pulsing light. Below that was a darker opening, and from it came a hissing sound that made my teeth ache. The creature didn't walk toward us. It glided, moving across the uneven ground without its body bobbing or swaying, as if gravity had no hold on it. The dark fabric around it wasn't clothing, I realized. It was part of the thing, extensions of its body that writhed and twisted like tentacles made of shadow. One of them reached out toward us, and I could see it was leaving a trail of that mist in its wake. The same mist that was now filling my lungs and making my head swim. I don't remember making the decision to run. My body just moved, dropping the flashlight, spinning around, and sprinting back down that hill faster than I'd ever run in my life. Behind me, I could hear the others crashing through the brush. Mrs. May screaming for her boys, someone sobbing in pure animal terror. That hissing followed us, rising and falling in pitch, and with it came a smell so putrid that I vomited while still running, not stopping, not slowing down. We burst out of the tree line and onto the road, gasping and wild-eyed. Under the streetlight near Mrs. May's house, we could see each other clearly for the first time since leaving the hill. Teddy's nose was bleeding, thick dark streams running down his chin. Mrs. May's lips had a blue tinge, and she was struggling to breathe. My own throat felt like I inhaled acid, every breath a knife of pain. We looked like people who had been exposed to something toxic, something that was still eating away at us from the inside. The sheriff came within the hour. Lee Stewart was his name, a skeptical man who made no secret of thinking we were pulling some kind of prank. But when he saw Mrs. May's condition, saw the way we were all struggling to breathe, his expression changed. He went up that hill with 3 deputies and came back 30 minutes later, pale and quiet. He wouldn't say what he'd seen, but he made a phone call from Mrs. May's house. And within 2 hours, there were military vehicles blocking off Braxton Hill Road. They told us we'd seen an owl. A barn owl, they said, perched on a branch. Its eyes reflecting our flashlight, the meteor unrelated, probably burning up miles away. They brought in an Air Force captain who smiled and nodded and took notes while making it clear that continuing to tell our story would not be in our best interests. The newspapers ran with the owl explanation. Some added details about mass hysteria, about rural people prone to superstition and exaggeration. But here is what they didn't report. 3 of us ended up in the hospital that night with symptoms the doctors couldn't explain. Our white blood cell counts were through the roof. We had burns on our skin that looked like radiation exposure. Teddy lost his sense of smell permanently. Mrs. May developed a throat condition that plagued her for the rest of her life. I started having seizures, small ones at first, then gradually worse, until I had to give up driving. And here is what really keeps me awake at night. 2 days after our encounter, a farmer named William Braxton, whose property bordered the Fisher place, disappeared. They found his truck abandoned on the logging road, driver, his door open, engine still running. They found his rifle lying in the dirt about 20 yards into the woods, both barrels discharged. They never found William. The search party that went looking for him found something else though, something they tried to keep quiet but that leaked out through the firefighters who were there. There was a circular area, about 40 feet in diameter, where all the vegetation was dead. Not just dead, but desiccated, reduced to ash and dust as if it had been there for decades instead of days. The trees at the edge of this circle were blackened on the side facing inward. And in the center, there were marks in the earth, deep impressions that didn't match any known animal or vehicle, arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at, as if the angles were slightly off from what geometry allowed. I went back to Braxton Hill exactly once, in 1955, 3 years after that night. I needed to see it in daylight, needed to prove to myself that it had just been fear and darkness playing tricks. I hiked up alone on a bright October morning, leaves crunching under my boots, squirrels chattering in the trees. Everything normal, everything safe. I found the oak tree where the thing had been. The tree was dead, had been since that night. Every tree within 15 feet of it was dead. The ground underneath was still bare, nothing growing, nothing living. I knelt down and touched the earth, and it was cold, colder than it should have been, colder than the surrounding ground by at least 20 degrees. When I pulled my hand back, my fingers were numb, and I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There were scratches in the bark of the dead oak, high up, at least 10 feet off the ground. Deep gouges, 4 of them parallel, as if something with claws had gripped the tree. But they didn't go down the way they would if something had climbed. They went up, as if the thing had been pulling itself toward the sky, using the tree for leverage as it ascended. I ran down that hill for the second time in my life and never went back. The Fisher property was sold to a development company in the 60s. They tried to build houses there, but workers kept quitting. They reported equipment malfunctions, compasses spinning wildly, feelings of being watched. One bulldozer operator swore he saw something tall moving between the trees at dusk, something that glided rather than walked. The project was abandoned, and the land sits empty to this day, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. I'm 89 years old now. Most of the others who were there that night are gone. Mrs. May died in 1999, Teddy in 2007, Neil just last year. I'm one of the last living witnesses to what really happened on Braxton Hill, and I'm telling you this because the official explanation is a lie. We didn't see an owl. We saw something that came from somewhere else, something that our government knew about and chose to hide. I've spent 70 years trying to make sense of that night, reading everything I could find about unexplained phenomena, about other encounters that got dismissed or covered up. I've found patterns, connections between sightings in places where people go missing, where animals want to go, where the electromagnetic readings spike for no reason. Braxton Hill is marked on some maps I've seen, maps that aren't available to the public, marked with symbols I don't understand, but that appear in other locations where strange things have been reported. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't unique, it wasn't alone, and I don't think it left. I think it changed, adapted, learned to hide better. Sometimes, late at night, I see things in the news, stories about hikers vanishing in national forests, about entire communities reporting the same nightmare, about military operations in remote areas with no explanation given. And I wonder if they were dealing with more of them, if that night in 1952 was just the first time they couldn't keep it quiet. The worst part, the thing that haunts me more than the memory of those glowing eyes or that horrible hissing, is this. Right before we ran, right before my legs carried me away from that hillside, the thing tilted its head. It was a gesture that felt almost curious, as if it was studying us, learning about us. And in that moment, I had the overwhelming sense that we weren't the first humans it had observed, and we wouldn't be the last. We were specimens, test subjects, and whatever experiment it was conducting, it just failed. So when you read driving through West Virginia, through those dark hollers and forgotten towns, past those empty farmhouses and silent forests, remember that some places have secrets buried so deep that even time can to heal them. And if you ever see a red light pulsing in the sky, descending in an arc too controlled to be natural, do what I should have done. Turn around, go home, lock your doors, because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some things that crash in the night should be left alone in the darkness where they fell. What would you have done if you had been there that night on Braxton Hill? Would you have run, or would you have stayed to see what it wanted? Let me know in the comments below. Story 8. Fire that left no ashes. I need to tell you something that happened to my grandfather. Something our family has kept quiet about for 79 years. After what I found last month in the ruins of the old Sauter property, I can't keep silent anymore. Because if I write about what really happened on Christmas Eve 1945, then those 5 children didn't die in that fire. And whatever took them might still be out there, waiting in the mountains of West Virginia. My name is David Brennan. My grandfather, George Sauter, died in 1969, never knowing what happened to his children. 5 of them vanished that night, disappeared without a trace while the house burned around them. But here is what kept him awake every night until his death. The fire department took 7 hours to arrive. The fire chief was drunk at a Christmas party. The phone lines had been cut. And when investigators finally sifted through the ashes 3 days later, they found nothing. Not a single bone fragment. Not a tooth, not a button or a buckle. Nothing. I grew up hearing whispers about that night, hushed conversations that stopped when I entered the room. My grandmother Jenny never recovered. She put up a billboard on Route 16 with the children, his faces, offering a reward. It stayed there for 40 years, fading in the mountain sun, until she died in 1989. I used to drive past it as a kid, staring at those black and white photographs. Maurice, 14. Martha, 12. Louis, 9. Jenny, 8. Betty, 5. They looked like regular kids. Happy, alive. But something always bothered me about the official story. Houses burn hot, sure, but not hot enough to completely vaporize human remains. The fire chief claimed the heat was so intense it cremated the bodies entirely. Except cremation requires temperatures above 1800 degrees for several hours. That wooden farmhouse burned for less than 45 minutes before collapsing. The math didn't add up. Last month, I drove out to Fayetteville. The property where the house stood has been empty for decades, overgrown with kudzu and poison ivy. Nobody wanted to buy land with that kind of history attached to it. I parked my truck on the old dirt road and walked through the woods, following the path my grandfather must have walked 1,000 times, searching for answers. The foundation was still visible, a rectangular scar of crumbling concrete slowly being reclaimed by the forest. I stood there in the October wind, leaves swirling around my boots, and I felt it. That wrongness, like the air itself, remembered what happened here. I started digging near what would have been the children's bedroom. Do you know what I expected to find? Maybe nothing, maybe just the closure of confirming they really had died that night. But 3 feet down, my shovel hit something that wasn't rock or root. It was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, sealed with tar or resin. My hands shook as I pried it open. Inside were 5 small cloth dolls, handmade, crude. Each one had a name stitched into its chest in thread that had gone brown with age. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty, and underneath each doll was a lock of human hair. I dropped the box. My heart hammered against my ribs. Someone had buried these here. Someone had taken hair from those children and made these dolls and hidden them in the ground before the house burned. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. This was ritual. I called the state police. They were polite but dismissive. The case was cold, they said. 79 years cold, without DNA testing, which they weren't going to authorize for a closed case. Those hair samples meant nothing. They suggested I contact a historical society if I wanted to preserve family artifacts. But I couldn't let it go. I started researching, pulling old newspaper articles from the Fayetteville Library, reading through the original investigation reports. And I found things that nobody had ever connected before. 2 weeks before the fire, a life insurance salesman visited the house. He told my grandfather his house would go up in smoke someday, and his children would destroy him. When George threw him out, the man said something strange. Your children are not your children anymore. The night of the fire, my grandmother saw a man watching the house from the hillside. He stood there for hours in the snow, not moving, just watching as the flames consumed everything. And here is what made my blood run cold. That same week, 2 other families in Fayette County reported their children having nightmares about a man in a long black coat who came into their rooms at night and whispered things to them. Things about fire and smoke and going away to a beautiful place where they would never be cold again. I found something else too. A notation in the fire chief's personal journal, donated to the Historical Society after his death. He wrote it 3 months after the fire, when he was dying of liver disease. I saw them loading the truck. I saw the children, but they paid me $5,000 and said if I talked, my family would burn too. God forgive me. They were alive. I felt sick reading those words. The fire chief had been bribed. The children had been taken. But taken where? And by whom? I started looking into disappearances in Appalachia in the 1940s. And that is when the pattern emerged. Between 1943 and 1947, 17 children vanished from the mountains of West Virginia, Kentucky, and Virginia. All during winter, all from remote locations, all from families that didn't quite fit in with their communities. The Sodders were Italian immigrants. They spoke broken English. They were Catholic in a Protestant region. They stood out. Every single one of those disappearances was eventually ruled as runaways or accidents. But none of the children were ever found. I drove deeper into research, and I found something that made me understand why our family never talked about this. In 1947, a burned-out bus was discovered in a ravine near Beckley. Inside were the remains of what investigators believed were 7 or 8 people, mostly children, based on the size of the bones. But the fire had been so intense and the bodies so badly destroyed that identification was impossible. The case was closed as a tragic accident, except that bus didn't belong to any school or church in the area. Nobody knew where it had come from or where it had been going. And when I tracked down the accident report, I found a detail that had been buried in the paperwork. Witnesses reported seeing the bus 3 hours before it crashed, parked behind an abandoned coal processing plant. A man in a long black coat was standing by the door. I went to that processing plant. It is still there, a skeleton of rusted metal and broken concrete, about 40 miles from where the solder house stood. The place felt wrong the moment I stepped onto the property. The woods around it were silent. No birds, no insects, just wind through dead trees. I explored the main building, my flashlight cutting through decades of darkness. Graffiti covered the walls, animal bones littered the floor, and in the basement, behind a collapsed wall, I found a room that made me understand everything. The walls were covered in names and dates, carved deep into the concrete. Hundreds of them, children's names. The oldest dated back to 1929. The newest was from 1951. And right there, carved larger than the rest, I found them. Maurice Sauter, December 25, 1945. Martha Sauter, December 25, 1945. Louis Sauter, December 25, 1945. Jenny Sauter, December 25, 1945. Betty Sauter, December 25, 1945. Below their names, someone had carved a symbol, a circle with lines radiating outward, like a sun or a wheel. And beneath that, words that made my stomach drop. The children of the mountain are the mountain's children now. I took photographs of everything. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone steady. And then I heard it, footsteps above me, slow, deliberate, moving across the floor of the processing plant. I killed my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched out for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then a voice called down into the darkness. Not loud, almost a whisper, but it carried perfectly in that dead air. You shouldn't have come here, David. It knew my name. I ran. I didn't plan. I just ran through that basement, scrambling over debris, my shoulders slamming into walls in the darkness. Behind me, the footsteps started again. Faster now. Heavier. Multiple sets of footsteps. I could hear breathing. Wet. Rattling. I found stairs and took them 3 at a time, burst out into the main floor. Gray light filtered through broken windows. I could see my truck through the trees, maybe 200 yards away. I ran toward it, branches whipping my face, my lungs burning. The footsteps followed, not running, walking, like they knew I couldn't escape. I reached my truck and fumbled with my keys. My hands were numb with cold or fear or both. The engine turned over and I floored the accelerator, dirt and gravel spraying as I fishtailed onto the access road. In my rearview mirror, I saw them emerge from the tree line. 5 figures, small, child-sized. They stood perfectly still, watching me drive away. I didn't stop until I reached the interstate. My hands were still shaking when I pulled into a pilot truck stop outside Charleston. I sat in the parking lot, surrounded by the normal world of diesel fumes and highway noise, and tried to convince myself I imagined it. Panic, shadows, my mind playing tricks, but I had the photographs. I pulled them up on my phone. The names carved in the concrete, the symbol, the dates, all of it real, all of it there. And then I saw something I missed while I was in that basement. In the corner of one photograph, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. Small, standing motionless, watching me take pictures. And even though the image was dark and grainy, I could make out enough detail to see that the figure was wearing clothing from the 1940s. A child in an old-fashioned dress. I deleted the photos, all of them. Then I deleted them from my deleted folder. I threw my phone into a dumpster and bought a burner from the truck stop convenience store. I haven't been back to West Virginia since. But here, it's the thing that keeps me awake at night. 2 days after I left that processing plant, I got a letter at my house in Ohio. No return address, no postage stamp, just my name written in precise, old-fashioned handwriting. Inside was a photograph, a Polaroid, faded and yellowed with age. It showed 5 children standing in front of a gray concrete wall. They were holding hands. They were smiling, and I recognized them immediately from the billboard photographs I grown up seeing. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sauter. But this photograph wasn't from 1945. In the bottom corner, written in pen, was the date, June 14th, 1968. 23 years after they vanished, and they hadn't aged a day. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a message. The mountain keeps what the mountain takes. Your grandfather understood? Now you do too, Don. To come back. I burned the photograph. I should have gone to the police. But what would I tell them? That I broke into an abandoned building and found carvings? That I received an impossible photograph? They would think I was crazy. Hell, maybe I'm crazy. But I know what I saw in that basement. I know what followed me through those woods. And I know those 5 children didn't die in any fire. Something took them. Something that lives in the deep places of Appalachia. In the abandoned mines and forgotten valleys where the mountains press in close and the sun never quite reaches. My grandfather spent 44 years searching for answers. He died without finding them. But now I understand why Jenny kept that billboard up for so long. It wasn't about finding the children anymore. It was a warning, a memorial, a way of saying that something had taken them, and that same something was still out there. I think about those other names carved into the wall. Hundreds of them, children vanishing across decades, all in the same mountain region, all in the same silent way. And I think about what the life insurance salesman said. Your children are not your children anymore. What if he wasn't making a threat? What if he was stating a fact? What if something in those mountains had claimed those children, and the fire was just a cover-up to hide their disappearance? What if the people who knew what happened, the fire chief, the investigators, the witnesses, were all paid or threatened into silence because the truth was too terrible to acknowledge? Last week, I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw a post from a woman in Kentucky. Her niece had gone missing while camping near the Daniel Boone National Forest. 7 years old, vanished from her tent while the family slept. The search had been called off after 3 days. No trace, no leads, just gone. And in the comments, someone had posted a grainy photograph they'd taken near the search area. It showed trees and shadows and a trick of the light. But if you looked closely, you could see small figures standing between the trees. 5 of them, holding hands, too far away to see clearly. But there, I wanted to message that woman. I wanted to warn her. But what would I say? That her niece was taken by something in the mountains? That she might still be alive somewhere, trapped in a place where time doesn't work the same way? That there's nothing she can do because this thing has been taking children for almost 100 years and nobody has been able to stop it? So I said nothing, just like everyone else who knows, just like my family has been doing for 79 years. But I am telling you now, if you, re-listening to this, if you have children, if you live anywhere near the Appalachian Mountains, listen carefully. Don't let your kids wander into the woods alone. Don't to camp in areas that feel wrong. Don't to ignore that instinct that tells you to leave. And if you see a man in a long black coat watching your house, call the police. Lock your doors. Get out, because the mountain keeps what the mountain takes. And it's always hungry. My grandfather used to say something before he died. He'd sit on the porch in the evening, looking toward West Virginia, and he'd whisper it like a prayer. They'd re-still there. They'd re-still in the mountains. And someday they'll come home. I used to think he meant their bodies would be found. Now I understand. He meant something else entirely. He meant they were still alive, still walking through those dark valleys and abandoned buildings, still standing between the trees, still waiting. And maybe that is worse than death. Maybe that is what hell really is. Not fire and brimstone, just forever in the cold mountain darkness, belonging to something that should never have existed. I don't know if I'll ever go back to West Virginia. Part of me knows I should. Part of me knows someone needs to find that room and document what was carved there before it was lost forever. But every time I think about it, I remember those 5 small figures watching me drive away. I remember how they moved, like they were still children, but something else was using their bodies. Something ancient and patient and hungry. The Sauter children have been missing for 79 years, but they were not dead. I'm certain of that now. They somewhere in the mountains, trapped in whatever hell that place is. And they were not alone. Hundreds of other children are there with them, taken across decades, forgotten by everyone except their families. So that's my question for you. If you discovered that someone you loved hadn't died but had been taken to a place like that, would you try to save them? Or would you let them stay lost, knowing that some doors should never be opened and some truths are too terrible to face? Write your answer in the comments, because I need to know. I need to know if I'm the only one who thinks we should go back into those mountains and find out what's really been happening there for the last 100 years. Or if I'm just crazy, seeing patterns where there are none, connecting dots that should stay scattered. Either way, I can stop thinking about those 5 children standing in the trees, holding hands, watching, waiting, still there after all these years, still there in the mountains. Story 9. Once you remember, I found the photographs in my grandfather's attic 3 weeks after his funeral. They were hidden inside a metal lockbox buried under decades of Christmas decorations and moth-eaten quilts in his farmhouse outside Sneedville, Tennessee. The box had no key. I had to use bolt cutters. Inside were maybe 40 black and white photographs, all taken in the 30s and 40s, all showing the same group of people. Dark-skinned people with features I couldn't quite place. Mediterranean, maybe, or Middle Eastern, or something else entirely. Their eyes were what got me. Every single person in those photos had the same look. Not fear exactly, more like knowledge, like they understood something the rest of us didn't. Tucked between the photos was a leather journal. My grandfather's handwriting filled every page. The first entry was dated August 1962. I was born in '63. He had been writing this thing my entire life, and I never knew it existed. The journal started with a simple sentence that made my skin crawl. They told me their secret, and now I cannot sleep. My grandfather had been a surveyor for the Tennessee Valley Authority back in the '60s. His job took him deep into the Appalachian ridges, mapping property lines and watershed boundaries in places most people never saw. Remote hollows where the old ways persisted, communities that wanted nothing to do with the outside world. He wrote about weeks spent hiking through dense forest, sleeping in his truck, eating cold beans from a can. Solitary work that suited his temperament. In September of '62, he was surveying land near Newman's Ridge in Hancock County. That is Melungeon country. Even now, most Americans have never heard that word. Melungeon. It refers to a group of people who have lived in the Appalachian Highlands since before anyone kept records. Dark-skinned, dark-haired, with ancestry no one can quite pin down. For centuries, they lived isolated on remote ridgetops, intermarrying, speaking their own dialect, following customs that seemed to come from nowhere or everywhere. Theories about their origin have circulated for generations. Some say they descended from Portuguese sailors shipwrecked on the Carolina coast in the 1500s, who walked inland and disappeared into the mountains. Others claim Turkish or Moorish ancestry, pointing to old family names like Goins and Collins that might trace back to Mediterranean roots. A few researchers have suggested they were remnants of the lost Roanoke colony. The DNA studies that have been done show a bewildering mix. European, African, Native American, and traces of something else. Something the geneticists couldn't identify. Markers that didn't match any known population group. For most of American history, the Melungeons were treated as outcasts. Too dark for white society, too different for black communities, speaking a dialect peppered with words no linguist could source. They were denied the right to vote, barred from white schools, forced to live on land nobody else wanted. The ridgetops, the thin soil and rocky ground where farming was nearly impossible. They survived anyway, generation after generation, clinging to those heights, watching the world below but never quite joining it. My grandfather encountered a Melungeon settlement on his third day surveying Newman's Ridge. He crested a rise and found maybe 20 houses scattered through a clearing. Small cabins built from hand-hewn logs, with stone chimneys and metal roofs. Gardens growing vegetables he didn't recognize. Children playing in the dirt with toys that looked ancient. And every person he saw had that same dark complexion, those same unplaceable features. He wrote that the settlement felt wrong somehow. Not threatening, wrong, like he had walked through a door into a place that operated under different rules. The light seemed dimmer even though the sun was directly overhead. Sounds were muffled. His compass started spinning, the needle unable to find north. He stood at the edge of the clearing, uncertain whether to announce himself or retreat, when an old woman emerged from the nearest cabin. She walked right up to him, looked him over with eyes so dark they seemed black. Then she smiled and told him to come inside. They needed to talk. He followed her, not sure why, just feeling like refusal would be worse than acceptance. The cabin interior was spotless. Dried herbs hung from the rafters. A wood stove radiated heat even though it was September and warm outside. She sat him down at a rough table and poured coffee from a pot that smelled like nothing he had ever tasted. Bitter and sweet at the same time, with undertones of something he couldn't name. She told him her people had been waiting for someone like him. Someone from the outside who would listen. Someone who could carry their story forward when they were gone. He asked what she meant. She said her people were dying. Not from disease, from time. They had been in these mountains for so long, keeping their knowledge alive, passing down through bloodlines that stretched back further than America, further than colonization, further than written history. But the old ways were fading. The children were leaving for cities. The language was being forgotten. Soon there would be no one left who remembered where they came from, or what they were protecting. My grandfather wrote that he laughed nervously and said she was being dramatic. Cultures evolved. People moved on. That was natural. The old woman shook her head. She said he didn't understand. Her people weren't just another ethnic group. They were keepers, guardians of something that had been placed in these mountains thousands of years ago. Something that needed to stay hidden. Something that would wake up if the bloodlines died out completely. He asked what she was talking about. She stood and walked to a corner of the cabin. From beneath a loose floorboard, she retrieved a clay jar sealed with wax. She set it on the table between them. The jar was old in a way that made his eye twitch. Old like the pottery he had seen in museums, labeled pre-Columbian or older. The clay was covered in symbols. Not Cherokee, not any Native American writing system he recognized. The symbols seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new configurations. The old woman told him the jar contained a map. Not a map of land or water, a map of something else. She said her ancestors had been brought to these mountains specifically to guard locations marked on that map. Brought by whom? She wouldn't say, or couldn't say. The language she used suggested people, but also something beyond people. Entities that existed before human civilization. Entities that had made agreements with certain bloodlines. Protection and isolation in exchange for eternal vigilance. My grandfather wanted to leave. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was nonsense. Superstition. The kind of backward thinking that kept communities poor and isolated. But he couldn't stand up. Couldn't make his legs work. The coffee he had drunk was doing something to him. Not drugging him exactly, opening him, making him receptive to things he normally would have dismissed. The old woman opened the jar. Inside was a roll of leather so old it was almost petrified. She unrolled it carefully on the table. The leather was covered in more of those shifting symbols, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But underneath the symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood, was a map of the Appalachian mountain chain. From Georgia to Pennsylvania, hundreds of miles, and scattered along the ridgelines were marks. 17 marks total, small circles with symbols inside them. She pointed to one circle, said that mark represented a door, a threshold between here and somewhere else. Somewhere that humans shouldn't go, couldn't survive going. Her ancestors had been charged with keeping those doors sealed, with living on the land above them, maintaining the wards, performing the rituals that kept the seals strong. For generations uncounted, they had done this work in isolation and silence, letting the outside world think they were just another group of mixed-race outcasts. Better to be despised than discovered. But the bloodlines were thinning. Children of the keepers were marrying outsiders, diluting the connection. The doors were beginning to weaken. She could feel it. All her people could feel it. A pressure building beneath the mountains. Something vast and patient becoming aware that its prison was failing. My grandfather wrote that he finally managed to stand. He thanked her for the coffee and backed toward the door. The old woman didn't try to stop him. She just rolled up the leather map and placed it back in the jar. Then she looked at him with those black eyes and said he would remember, whether he wanted to or not. The coffee ensured that. He was marked now, connected. He would feel it when the first door opened. And he would know, in his bones, that his inaction had contributed to what came next. He left the settlement, finished his survey work, drove back to Needville and filed his reports. Tried to forget the whole encounter. Tried to convince himself it had been heat exhaustion or contaminated water. But the dreams started that winter. Dreams of standing on Newman, this ridge at night, watching lights move beneath the ground. Watching the earth ripple like water. Watching shapes press up from below. Testing the boundaries. Searching for weak points. Over the next 40 years, my grandfather tracked the Melungeon population. He subscribed to genealogy newsletters and local newspapers from Hancock County. He attended conferences on Appalachian history. He collected every scrap of information he could find about those mysterious people and their origins. And he documented something disturbing. The population was declining faster than birth rates and migration could explain. Families were vanishing, not moving away, vanishing. Entire bloodlines ending abruptly with no record of death or departure. By the 90s, fewer than 200 people in Hancock County would openly claim Melungeon heritage. The settlements on the ridgetops were abandoned. The old cabins rotted into the ground. The graveyards grew over with kudzu and poison ivy. My grandfather wrote that he could feel something building, a pressure in his chest when he visited the mountains, a sense of anticipation hanging over the ridgelines like fog. The last entry in his journal was dated 2 months before he died. He had driven back to Newman Ridge one final time. The settlement where he met the old woman was gone. Not demolished, gone. The clearing had filled in with trees that looked decades old, even though he had been there just 40 years earlier. Time was wrong on that ridgetop. Moving differently, he parked his truck and hiked up to the highest point. From there, he could see the entire Appalachian chain stretching north and south. Beautiful and ancient and absolutely silent. Then he felt it, a vibration in the ground. Subtle but unmistakable, coming from deep below, a rhythm like breathing or like something enormous stirring in sleep. He stood there for an hour, feeling that pulse, and he finally understood what the old woman had tried to tell him. The doors weren't keeping things out, they were keeping things in. And without the keepers, without the bloodlines and the rituals and the eternal vigilance, those things would wake up. He wrote one final sentence before closing the journal. I am sorry I did not believe. I am sorry I did nothing. I am sorry for what comes next. I spent a week reading and rereading that journal. I looked up everything I could find about the Melungeons. The sparse academic papers, the family histories, the DNA studies that raised more questions than they answered. I found references to the 17 sacred sites mentioned on the old woman, this map. Most had been developed over. Shopping malls and subdivisions and industrial parks built directly on top of ancient ridgetop settlements, breaking the seals without ever knowing they existed. Last month, I drove to Newman Ridge myself. I'm not sure what I expected to find. Some proof that my grandfather had been suffering from dementia. Some rational explanation. I parked where he had parked and hiked to the highest point. The view was exactly as he described it. The forest was silent. No birds. No insects. Nothing. And then I felt it. That vibration. That deep pulse coming from beneath the mountains. Not imagination. Not wishful thinking. Real. Rhythmic. Getting stronger. I stood there with my hand pressed against a tree trunk, feeling the earth breathe, and I understood with perfect clarity that something was waking up. Something that had been sleeping since before humans named these mountains. Something the keepers had spent millennia holding back. I don't know what happens when it fully wakes. I don't know if anyone can stop it. The bloodlines are broken. The rituals are forgotten. The doors are opening. All I know is that my grandfather tried to warn someone, anyone, and no one listened. He documented everything, and it didn't matter. The Melungeons were dismissed as a curiosity. Their warnings were lost to time and prejudice and the arrogance of people who think isolated communities have nothing important to say. Now I lie awake at night, feeling that pulse. It's getting stronger, faster, like a heartbeat accelerating, and I wonder how long we have before whatever is down there finally breaks through. Days? Months? Years? And when it does, will anyone even connect it to the dark-skinned people who lived on the ridgetops? Will anyone remember that they tried to protect us? That they sacrificed everything to keep us safe? Or will we just call it an earthquake and move on, blind and stupid, until it is far too late? If you lived near one of those ancient ridgetop settlements and started feeling vibrations from deep underground, what would you do? Write your answer in the comments.
Thank you for visiting to Midnight Whisper Stories. I am the creator of this channel, where every dark story is designed to help you escape the noise of the day and immerse yourself in worlds that spark your imagination. I write every script, design every image, hear voice actors to bring my stories to life, and edit everything myself. So sit back, relax, and let the whispers of the night guide you.